In September 1943, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Mitchell lifted off from an English airfield in a P-51 Mustang for what his squadron had been told was a routine reconnaissance sweep over occupied France. The task sounded ordinary, a simple out and back to collect photographs and observations. His Mustang never returned. When hours passed without contact, the Army Air Forces listed him missing in action and, soon after, presumed dead. At home, his family received the standard letter of condolence and a carefully folded flag, the formal symbols of a loss no one could fully explain. 60 years later, hikers fought through undergrowth in a Belgian forest and came upon a tangle of corroded aluminum half buried in leaves and soil. The wreck, identified as a P-51, lay roughly 200 meters from the course his flight was supposed to have followed. The airframe was speckled with bullet holes, but the spacing and angles did not match familiar enemy fighter patterns. Inside the cockpit, investigators recovered items that transformed a routine discovery into a problem no one had expected. A weathered wallet, a handful of photographs, and military papers whose presence would force officials to acknowledge a mission so sensitive it had remained hidden for decades. An operation to extract Allied prisoners from a camp that, officially, never existed. Captain David Mitchell had been staring at a motionless stack of personnel files for 20 minutes when a call cut through the quiet. As the Army Air Force's liaison to the Joint Missing Personnel Accounting Agency, he had learned to expect that most cold cases went nowhere. All too often, an exciting tip would dissolve into civilian wreckage or be misidentified as military hardware from conflicts decades newer than World War II. This call did not feel like that. Captain Mitchell, this is Detective Laurent Dubois with the Belgian Federal Police. We have aircraft wreckage that your database indicates belongs to a Lieutenant Robert Mitchell, reported missing in September 1943. David's pen stopped in the middle of a requisition form. Mitchell was not a rare surname, but the timing struck home. His grandfather had been Robert Mitchell, Bobby to his friends, missing since 1943. "Can you give me the details, Detective?" he asked. "Hikers found the wreckage yesterday in the Ardennes forest," Dubois said, "about 40 kilometers southeast of Bastogne. Appears to be a P-51 Mustang, tail number 44-13267. The registration traces to your agency." David turned to his terminal and brought up the database, his fingers moving on instinct. The tail number opened a file he had never seen, its banner marked by classification levels above his clearance. "Detective, I'm going to need to call you back. Can you secure the site?" he added. "Already done," Dubois said, "but Captain, there's something else. We found personal effects in the cockpit, a wallet, some photographs, and what appears to be military documents. The wallet contains identification for Lieutenant Robert Mitchell." David stared at his screen, where his grandfather's portrait looked out from a file labeled Classified, Historical Review Pending. "I'll be on the next flight to Brussels," he said. After hanging up, he sat in his office at Dover Air Force Base and tried to absorb it. His grandfather's plane had been found. After 60 years, Bobby Mitchell was, in some measure, coming home, but the map would not line up in his mind. The location felt wrong. He reached for a private folder, the one his grandmother had given him 5 years before she died. The War Department's last letter, dated October 15, 1943, stated that Lieutenant Mitchell had been lost during a reconnaissance mission over northern France. Search efforts had been concentrated around Amy, nearly 200 miles from the Belgian crash site. He opened the family's copy of the personnel file and read the facts he already knew by heart. Bobby had been 24 when he vanished, a fighter pilot with the 357th Fighter Group. He had been married 8 months to Sarah, David's grandmother. There were no children yet. David's father would not arrive until 1946, 2 years after Sarah remarried. The official account had always been simple: a routine mission, a plane that did not return, most likely brought down by enemy fighters. It was the kind of clean narrative that issued benefits and ended with a folded flag. But if Bobby had been sent to fly reconnaissance over Amy, why was his Mustang in the Belgian Ardennes? He picked up the phone and called Colonel Janet Thornton's direct line. As the head of Historical Records Review, she could see files he could not. "Janet, it's David Mitchell. I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" "My grandfather's plane was just found in Belgium. The location doesn't match his last known mission parameters." "David, you know I can't discuss classified historical records even with family members," she said. "I'm not asking as family," he replied. "I'm asking as the JPAC liaison who's about to fly to Belgium to identify remains and recover a missing aircraft. If there are operational details that affect the investigation, I need to know them." Thornton was silent for a moment. "Send me the coordinates of the wreckage site," she said finally. "I'll see what I can find. And, David." "Yes?" "The database shows Bobby's file is under historical review." "What does that mean?" "It means someone's been asking questions about Lieutenant Robert Mitchell," she said. "Questions that require answers above my clearance level." David ended the call and booked his flight to Brussels. He packed his identification and investigation materials with practiced economy, but his thoughts kept circling back to his grandmother's voice. Sarah had always said Bobby was too good a pilot to get lost on a simple reconnaissance mission. She insisted that something else had happened, something the military had never told them. For 60 years, the family had assumed grief was talking. Now he wondered if she had seen more clearly than anyone. The flight to Brussels gave David long hours to review what he knew. Bobby had joined the Army Air Forces in 1942, trained as a fighter pilot, and shipped to England early in 1943. He flew 28 combat missions with the 357th Fighter Group before disappearing on what would have been his 29th. 28 successful missions described a disciplined, capable aviator, not someone likely to drift off course or make a navigation mistake that would put him 200 meters from his supposed flight path. He pictured the forest the detective had described, trunks pressed together, a canopy filtering light to a green haze, metal half sunk in soil that had swallowed its secret one season at a time. He imagined the damage that did not fit a dogfight, the personal effects sealed in the cockpit, and the documents whose existence would force someone to unlock a file no one had discussed in decades. If those papers pointed to the rescue of Allied prisoners from a camp that officially never existed, then the misalignment between mission orders and crash site was not a footnote. It was the point. Questions multiplied as the cabin lights dimmed and the aircraft droned east. Who had diverted a reconnaissance pilot into Belgian airspace when the orders said northern France? Why did the bullet spread look unlike enemy fighters? Who had triggered the historical review? And to what end? He pressed his palm to the window and watched the dark ocean slide past below. This was no longer a file to be closed with a polite letter. It was family, a trail he intended to follow from a ring of trees in the Ardennes forest to a locked folder in a guarded archive, to the day when someone had decided that a camp could exist without ever being admitted on paper, and that a pilot's life could be folded into silence. David's phone vibrated once, the sharp buzz breaking the quiet. A message from Colonel Janet Thornton appeared. "File review complete. Can't discuss details over the phone. When you return from Belgium, come see me immediately. There are things about your grandfather's last mission that aren't in the standard record." He read it twice before sliding the phone into his pocket. Whatever she had found, it wasn't the kind of truth you spoke through a secure line. Detective Laurent Dubois was waiting the next morning at the Ardennes crash site. A man in his 50s, his manner was deliberate and exact, the kind of patience carved from decades of police work. "The hikers found it yesterday," he said as they moved through the forest. "They were following an old trail when they saw sunlight glint off metal." The wreck was more intact than David expected. The P-51 had slammed nose first into a steep hillside, burying its engine deep into the earth. The tail section and cockpit, though damaged, had survived decades under moss, saplings, and leaf fall. Even after 60 years, the Mustang's silhouette was clear, a shape built for speed now caught in the stillness of the woods. "No fire damage," David said, circling the site. Unusual for a combat loss. The forensics team noted that, Dubois replied. He led David to the port side of the fuselage, where a string of bullet holes lined the metal. These came from below and behind, not from fighters diving from above or coming head-on. David knelt, his gloved fingers tracing the punctures. Years of accident investigation told him how to read impact patterns. Low-level fire, he said, possibly from ground vehicles or troops. Have you recovered the personal effects? In evidence at the station, Dubois answered. We found Lieutenant Mitchell's wallet with ID, 2 photographs, one of a young woman, one of a military group, and a sealed envelope marked classified. What kind of documents? We haven't opened it, Dubois said. It's in surprisingly good shape, waterproofed. We decided to wait for military clearance. David felt his pulse quicken. Classified documents meant his grandfather's mission had never been what the family was told. I'll need to see everything, he said. As they walked back, the facts spun through his mind. His grandfather had been hundreds of miles from his reported mission, killed by fire from the ground, carrying sealed orders. Either Lieutenant Robert Mitchell had been part of something far more significant than reconnaissance, or someone had been lying to his family for 6 decades. The Belgian federal police station in Marche-en-Famenne was all glass and steel, stark against the town's medieval streets. Inside, Dubois guided him to the evidence room. On a stainless steel table lay the artifacts, each placed with care. The leather wallet was cracked but intact. The photographs, water-stained yet clear enough to read, rested in protective sleeves. The sealed envelope looked almost untouched, its edges sharp beneath a faint waxy coating from military waterproofing. Standard military ID, Dubois said, handing David a pair of gloves. Lieutenant Robert Mitchell, blood type O positive, some personal items. David studied the ID card. The young man staring back had the same eyes as the grandfather he'd only known from stories. Calm, steady, intent. The first photograph was of Sarah, his grandmother, smiling in a dress David recognized from family albums. The second photo stopped him. A group of men stood before what appeared to be a British airfield. Bobby was in the center, but the others were strangers. These aren't all pilots, David said. How do you know? Dubois asked. The uniforms. Some are Army Air Forces, others RAF or Free French. And this man, David pointed to a figure in civilian clothes. He's not military at all. Dubois jotted notes. A mixed group, including civilians. Unusual. It suggests special operations, David said, or liaison work with resistance networks. He didn't say aloud that such a unit wouldn't appear in squadron records. He glanced at the envelope. I need to contact my superiors before opening this. But first, where exactly was the plane found? Dubois unrolled a detailed topographical map, circling a spot southeast of Bastogne. Deep forest, no roads, no settlements, difficult terrain. If your grandfather was trying to return to Allied lines, this is an odd route. David traced the lines on the map, matching them with the September 1943 battle positions. This was deep in German-held territory. If he'd been over Amiens, he should have been heading west toward the Channel, not southeast into Belgium. Unless he wasn't flying reconnaissance, Dubois said quietly. Before David could answer, his phone rang. Thornton's name lit the screen. Where are you? She asked. At the Belgian station. We recovered personal effects, including a classified envelope. Negative, she said instantly. Do not open anything marked classified. David stared at the envelope on the table, its seal unbroken after 60 years. Whatever it contained, someone had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden, and the war might not be the only reason why. David's phone lit up again, the vibration rattling against the steel examination table. A call from Colonel Thornton. I'm flying to Brussels tonight with a team from the Historical Review Board, she said without preamble. We'll handle the documents. A familiar frustration rose in David's chest. Colonel, I'm the assigned investigator for this case. If there are operational details... David, listen to me carefully, she cut in. Your grandfather's file has been flagged for review by agencies above my clearance level. This isn't just family curiosity anymore. There are national security implications. He felt his jaw tighten. What kind of implications? The kind that gets people reassigned to a desk in Alaska if they ask too many questions. Secure everything and wait for my team. The line went dead, leaving David staring at the sealed envelope on the table. Whatever lay inside had been worth carrying into enemy territory, and somehow it was still dangerous after 60 years. Trouble with your superiors? Dubois asked, watching him closely. Something like that. They want me to wait. Bureaucracy, the detective said with a faint smile. Same in every country, but you don't seem like the type to wait. David weighed his options. Officially, he was bound to follow orders. Unofficially, he was the JPAC liaison on site and investigating his own grandfather's death, an authority no one could easily override. What do Belgian procedures say about military documents recovered here? He asked. If they're found in our territory, they remain under Belgian jurisdiction until formally transferred to the appropriate authorities. That process can take days. David caught the faintest flicker in Dubois' eyes. A deliberate opening. And if a Belgian investigator examined them as part of a crash investigation, that, Dubois said, would be standard procedure. With careful precision, he used an evidence knife to break the seal. Inside were 3 items. A typewritten mission briefing stamped eyes only, a hand-drawn map with penciled coordinates, and a list of names paired with what looked like German addresses. David photographed each one before reading. The briefing froze him in place. Operation Nightingale. Classification, ultra-secret primary. Objective, extraction of high-value intelligence assets from the German POW facility. Secondary objective, destruction of the facility to prevent reprisals. Flight route modified for radar evasion. Pilot, Lieutenant Robert Mitchell. Voluntary mission. Expendable asset. Authority, combined chiefs of staff. Backup, not authorized. The map's coordinates matched exactly the crash site, labeled Extraction Point Alpha. The list of names included Allied officers listed as missing or POWs, alongside known German camp locations. Several names had been crossed out in red. Monterey, Dubois murmured, spotting one entry. Your grandfather was on a rescue mission. David felt the floor shift under him. Bobby Mitchell hadn't been lost on reconnaissance. He'd been sent to pull prisoners out of a German camp, with no promise of return. The orders called him an expendable asset. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unlisted number. Stop digging. Some secrets are buried for good reasons. A friend. He handed the phone to Dubois. The detective's frown deepened. Someone knows you're here, and they know you've seen this. David resealed the documents and slid them back into their envelope. I need to find that camp, he said. Can your records people pull data on German facilities in this region? Certainly, Dubois said. But if someone is watching, be careful. Careful doesn't find the truth, David replied. And after 60 years, my family deserves to know what happened. The University of Louvain's archives were among the most comprehensive in Europe for World War II research. Dr. Marie Vandenberg, chief archivist, ushered David and Dubois into a climate-controlled room where steel cabinets lined the walls like a fortress of locked memory. German POW facilities in the Ardennes, 1943, she said, unlocking a cabinet and pulling out thick folders. We have Wehrmacht records captured after the war, plus testimony from local resistance and liberated prisoners. David unfolded Bobby's hand-drawn map on the table. Vandenberg bent over it, tracing the pencil marks with a practiced eye. This point, your extraction alpha, corresponds to Stalag 17C, a small facility for captured Allied airmen. Dubois leaned closer. Small? How small? Fewer than 50 prisoners, she said. But according to resistance reports, these were not ordinary POWs. What made them different? Dubois asked. They were intelligence officers, downed pilots with sensitive mission knowledge, men the Germans believed worth special handling, prisoners whose information could change the war if broken. David stared at the map, the coordinates, the mission orders in his memory. The pieces locked into place with a click he could almost hear. His grandfather had died flying into the heart of occupied territory to rescue men whose capture the Allies could not afford. And someone, somewhere, still wanted that story to stay buried. David leaned on the edge of the table, his voice low. So Bobby wasn't just rescuing random prisoners, he was extracting intelligence assets who knew Allied secrets. It appears so, Doctor. Vandenberg confirmed. She slid a fresh file toward him. And look at this. Resistance report dated September 15th, 1943, just 2 weeks before your grandfather's disappearance. David scanned the brittle pages. The local underground had reported unusual movements at Stalag 17C. Senior German officers arriving from Berlin and crates of specialized interrogation equipment unloaded under guard. They were preparing for something, David murmured. Or, Dubois countered, someone was trying to stop something. Vandenberg spread more papers across the table. The camp was evacuated on September 30th, 1943. All prisoners were transferred to unknown locations. No record of what happened after. David's eyes darted to his grandfather's mission date, September 28th, 1943. 2 days before the evacuation. That can't be a coincidence. He was trying to get them out before they disappeared somewhere worse. His phone rang, shattering the stillness. Thornton's name. "Where are you, David?" Her tone was clipped. "Following up on historical records for the crash investigation. I told you to wait for my team. We're landing in Brussels in 3 hours. I found documentation about a German POW facility near the—" "Stop. Whatever you think you've found is still sensitive to current operations." David stepped away from the table. "Current operations? Janet, this was 1943. Some secrets don't have expiration dates. Meet me at the embassy when I land. Bring everything, and stop your independent research." She hung up. When he returned to the table, Vandenberg was reading from a small leather-bound diary. "Captain, you'll want to hear this. Entry, September 28th, 1943. American plane shot down near 17C. The pilot tried to reach the camp, but was engaged by a German patrol. Local fighters recovered the pilot's body and buried him in the forest. Germans searched 3 days, found nothing." David's breath caught. "He made it to the ground alive?" "According to this," she said, "yes." The fighter writes that the pilot spoke English, carried an American ID, and had detailed knowledge of the camp layout. "What happened to the body?" "They buried him with military honors. But here's the important part. Before he died, he gave them something. A list of names and a message for Allied intelligence. Tell them the Nightingales are flying into a trap. The Germans know about extraction protocols." A cold weight settled in David's stomach. Bobby hadn't just been on a rescue. He'd been trying to warn command that their operations were compromised. "Does it say what happened to the list?" David asked. The fighter claims he gave it to a British intelligence officer who contacted him 3 days later. But he suspected the man was a German agent using stolen credentials. David's phone buzzed again. Another anonymous text. "Your grandfather died protecting secrets that could still get people killed. Stop while you can still walk away." He showed it to Dubois. "Someone really doesn't want you learning the truth," the detective said. "Or they don't want me learning who betrayed the truth." Vandenberg flipped to another entry. "Listen to this. Several other extraction missions failed around the same time, all with precise German responses, as if they knew exactly when and where they'd occur." "Meaning," David said slowly, "someone inside Allied command was feeding them information." "And your grandfather discovered it," Dubois added. "That's why his mission listed him as expendable asset. Someone wanted him silenced." David swallowed hard. "Do we have any record of who authorized his orders?" "Signed by the combined chiefs of staff," Vandenberg said, "which could mean any number of senior figures. Tracing the real origin will take time." She looked up. "Captain, if you're right, The people behind this may still hold influence. Before David could answer, his phone rang again. Caller ID, unknown. Captain Mitchell, an elderly American voice, faintly trembling with age. Yes, who is this? My name is Frank Henley. I was a prisoner at Stalag 17C in September 1943. I've been waiting 60 years for someone to ask the right questions about the pilot who tried to save us. David motioned for silence from Dubois and Vandenberg. Mr. Henley, where are you? In Belgium. Came as soon as I heard about the wreck. Captain, your grandfather was a hero. He died trying to warn Allied command about a traitor in their ranks. But the wrong people got his message first. Can you meet with me? Where? I'm already here. Hotel lobby, downstairs from you. And Captain, I brought the list of names your grandfather died protecting. It's time the truth came out. David looked at Dubois, then at Vandenberg. Let's go. Within a span of just 2 hours, David had uncovered more than he'd imagined possible. His grandfather hadn't simply been a casualty of war. He had died on a mission sabotaged from within, attempting to rescue prisoners from a compromised camp while carrying proof of an Allied security breach. And now, one of those very prisoners was waiting just a few floors below, holding evidence that had been hidden for 6 decades. Dr. Vandenberg, can you secure duplicates of everything we've found? David asked. Of course, she replied, her tone edged with caution. But, Captain, if your grandfather's operation was betrayed from the inside, the people responsible may still be invested in keeping it buried. As they prepared to leave the archives, David recognized that this was no longer just an investigation into a wartime crash. He was walking headfirst into a web of deceit, one that had cost Bobby Mitchell his life and could have crippled Allied operations during the war. The real question now was whether he could expose it before those same forces decided that the grandson had learned too much. Frank Henley was waiting in the lobby, a man in his late 90s with the posture of someone who had endured trials that would break most. His eyes were sharp, his handshake steady despite the wooden cane at his side. You're the spitting image of him, Frank said with a faint, knowing smile. Bobby talked about his family constantly. Said he'd have children one day who would grow up knowing their grandfather died for something worth dying for. Upstairs in Frank's modest hotel room, the view overlooked the cobbled streets of Marchand-Famenne. But Frank's focus was fixed on the weathered leather portfolio resting on the desk. Detective Dubois joined them, aware that whatever passed between them would need an official record. I've carried this for 60 years, Frank said, carefully unfastening the straps. Your grandfather made me promise, if I survived, I'd keep these safe until someone asked the right questions. Inside lay original papers in Bobby's unmistakable handwriting, several German intelligence documents, and a precise map of the camp. Bobby didn't die in the crash, Frank began, easing into a chair. His P-51 went down about half a mile from the camp. We heard the impact from our barracks and saw German patrols moving toward the sound. David leaned forward. How do you know what happened after? Because, Frank said. 2 hours later, he was standing inside our compound. David's eyes widened. Inside the camp? How? A grim smile crossed Frank's face. Your grandfather wasn't just a damn good pilot. He was a soldier through and through. He'd memorized the camp layout, studied patrol patterns, and somehow slipped through their defenses. Dubois kept his pen moving as Frank recounted the night. It was just after midnight, September 28th. I was the senior Allied officer, so Bobby came to me first. He explained his mission, to extract specific intelligence officers who knew about German code-breaking operations. Frank pulled out a list in Bobby's tidy handwriting. Lieutenant Commander James Hartwell, Royal Navy cryptographer. Captain Ernst Müller, Free French Intelligence Liaison. Flight Lieutenant William Page, RAF reconnaissance expert, and Frank himself, a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer specializing in German radio intercepts. You all had information about how the Germans were getting our secrets, David said. Exactly, but more than that? We'd all figured out that someone in Allied intelligence was giving them those secrets. Our frequencies, our codes, our mission schedules. We'd each uncovered parts of the same puzzle, and the Germans wanted to know just how much we knew and who else we might have told. Dubois looked up. So 17C wasn't just a POW camp. It was a holding pen for compromised Allied officers. Worse, Frank said. It was where they brought anyone who'd stumbled onto the fact that their own side had a traitor. The interrogations weren't just to gather military intel. They were to measure the damage to the LIAC. David felt the scope of the betrayal tightening around him. Bobby was there to pull out witnesses to Allied treachery. Exactly, and he nearly did it. Frank unfolded Bobby's map, annotated with guard rotations, blind spots, and a thin blue line marking a drainage tunnel from the kitchen to a culvert outside the fence. The plan was to move one man per night, over 3 nights, Frank explained. What went wrong? The same thing that killed every other op in that sector. The Germans knew. They were waiting. Bobby got Hartwell into the tunnel before guards hit both ends at once. They knew the route, the timing, everything. David's phone buzzed. Another anonymous message. Meeting with old prisoners is bad for your health. Some veterans forget about operational security. He showed it to Frank, who gave a bitter laugh. 60 years later, and the cover-up's still running. Who's they? David asked. The people who sent your grandfather to die. Not to save us, but to make sure we never spoke. The same ones who locked his files so no one could follow the trail. Frank produced a yellowed German document. He gave me this just before the guards caught him. It's a copy of a German intelligence report dated September 27, 1943, 1 day before his mission. Dubois scanned it. Mentions radio intercepts, mission schedules, personnel lists. If genuine, this proves the Germans had foreknowledge of Allied operations, down to the names involved. David sat back, staring at the list of names and the fragile papers in front of him. It was no longer just about proving his grandfather had been betrayed. It was about unmasking the people who had engineered it, and who might still be watching to make sure the truth stayed buried. Bobby had come across that German report during his infiltration, tucked away in the camp commandant's office. Frank explained that it was damning proof the Germans had foreknowledge of Allied missions, down to the exact timing, the personnel assigned, and the radio frequencies in use. Even without reading the language, David could pick out the patterns. Allied unit identifiers, communications codes, and tables that looked like operational timetables. This kind of intel, he said, could only have come from someone with access to the highest levels of Allied planning. And Bobby, it seemed, had reached the same conclusion. That's why, even after the rescue failed, he was determined to get the evidence back to Allied hands. What happened to him? David asked. Frank's voice dropped. The Germans caught Hartwell and Bobby in the drainage tunnel around 3 in the morning. They dragged them back to the admin building for interrogation. I was in a barracks facing that side of the camp. The lights in the commandant's office burned all night. At dawn, I saw soldiers carry something wrapped in a tarp toward the motor pool. His voice caught. I believe that was your grandfather. Frank hesitated, then added, but here's something you won't find in official reports. Bobby finished one part of his mission before they caught him. From his portfolio, Frank produced a small bundle of cloth. Inside was a compact military radio set, remarkably advanced for 1943. He had this with him to keep in touch with Allied command. Before capture, he transmitted what he'd found, the contents of that German report and confirmation that Allied operations had been compromised. David examined the device. Who did he transmit to? That's where things turn, Frank said. His assigned contact was a British intelligence officer with the call sign Blackbird. But when Bobby tried to warn him, the reply he got proved Blackbird was the leak. Frank opened a folded sheet of paper. This was his last written message, jotted during that final transmission. David read the note. Blackbird compromised. Germans are aware of extraction protocols. Mission betrayed from inside. German docs confirm Allied comms compromised. Blackbird feeding operational details. If I don't survive, investigate all missions authorized through the Blackbird channel. Lieutenant R. Mitchell. Final TX-0245 hours, 28th September 43. Who was Blackbird? David asked. Someone powerful enough to greenlight covert missions and bury their failures under classification, Frank said. And someone who could keep a file locked away for 60 years. David's phone rang. Colonel Thornton. I'm at the embassy. Bring everything you've got. I've found evidence Blackbird compromised my grandfather's... Stop! Get here now. That's an order. When the call ended, Frank shook his head. Your colonel doesn't want you pulling on this thread. Ask yourself why that matters after all this time. Because some secrets aren't buried with the people who kept them, Frank said. And because the ones who inherit them guard them just as fiercely. David realized he stood at the same crossroads his grandfather had once faced. Obey orders and let the truth vanish, or take the risk of exposing a betrayal that had cost Allied lives. Frank leaned forward. Captain, I'm 97 years old. I've carried this for 6 decades, waiting for someone willing to finish what Bobby started, exposing the traitors who sabotaged our missions. He didn't just try to save us, he tried to protect every Allied soldier still in the field from a poisoned chain of command. David glanced at the evidence spread out before him. German reports detailing compromised operations, Bobby's final message naming the leak, and the proof that the mission had been betrayed from within. Will you testify to this? He asked. I've been waiting for the chance. Through the window, David spotted 2 men in dark suits across the street, watching the hotel entrance. Whoever was protecting this secret was still watching him now. The U.S. Embassy in Brussels loomed like a fortress, all glass and steel. But as David walked inside, portfolio in hand, he felt more like a man walking into an ambush. Colonel Thornton met him in the lobby, flanked by 2 unfamiliar men, older, with the calm, assessing presence of intelligence veterans. David, these are Dr. William Stone and Mr. Richard Hayes from the State Department's Historical Classification Review Board, she said, her tone carefully neutral. They'd like to speak with you about your investigation. In the secure conference room, Stone gestured for him to sit. Captain Mitchell, we understand you've been researching your grandfather's final mission. We'd like to clear up some historical misunderstandings. David placed the portfolio on the table, but had already left full copies with Dubois as a safeguard. I found evidence that my grandfather's mission was sabotaged by someone using the codename Blackbird. The 2 men exchanged a look. Hayes leaned in slightly. Captain, what you're interpreting as wartime treachery was, in fact, part of an authorized counterintelligence program. David stared at them. Counterintelligence? Dr. Stone slid a classified folder across the table, his tone even. Operation Nightingale, he began, was a layered deception effort designed to feed misleading intelligence to the Germans. Your grandfather was aware his mission would appear to fail. The point was to convince enemy command that their sources were more valuable than they actually were. David felt the ground tilt beneath him. You're saying Bobby knew? Lieutenant Mitchell volunteered for a mission requiring that he be captured while carrying fabricated intelligence, Stone replied. The betrayal you believe you've uncovered was actually the successful execution of a counterintelligence strategy that protected thousands of Allied lives. Hayes slid forward another folder. The prisoners at Stalag 17C were part of the ruse. They carried false technical data intended to mislead German codebreakers about our communications. David thought about Frank Henley's testimony, the documents, and the radio transmissions. That's not what the evidence shows. Evidence can be misunderstood without full context, Stone said smoothly. Your grandfather died a hero, and the classification was to protect techniques we continued using throughout the war. Thornton stayed silent, but tension radiated from her posture. David, she said finally, these men have full jurisdiction over classified wartime operations. You need to transfer this case to them. David opened Frank's portfolio. I have Bobby's final radio message, in his own handwriting, naming Blackbird as a compromised source. Hayes studied the note. He was maintaining cover, even in his last transmission. That identification was deliberate misdirection designed to make the Germans believe their informant had been discovered. And the German report he retrieved. Proof that Allied ops were compromised. Planted, Stone replied without hesitation. Fabricated by our own people to inflate the value of the German source. Stone closed the folder. Everything you've brought us confirms that Operation Nightingale was a deception op. Your grandfather accomplished his mission and saved lives. David looked from one to the other. Everything had an official explanation. Every scrap of evidence could be reinterpreted to fit their narrative. What about Henley's testimony? He saw what happened. Hayes's smile was polite, almost pitying. Mr. Henley is a 97-year-old former POW. Memories from that time are often incomplete, shaped by stress and decades of speculation. His documents and the radio you recovered are consistent with our version of events. David's phone buzzed under the table. A text from Dubois. Hotel room searched. Henley relocated. Documents secure. Stone noticed the movement. Captain, further pursuit could endanger current intelligence work. There are national security implications. What kind? Hayes and Stone exchanged a glance. The methods in Nightingale form the basis for protocols still in use. Revealing them could compromise ongoing operations and put current assets in danger. Thornton finally spoke again. You have a choice. Accept the official record and your grandfather will be formally recognized, or keep digging and risk charges for leaking classified information. David felt the weight of 6 decades of silence. The official story was neat and honorable, something his family could embrace. The truth, if it was truth, was tangled, dangerous, and maybe impossible to prove. I need time to decide, he said. Stone shook his head. Time is one thing you don't have. Others have noticed your inquiries. Foreign intelligence services that would love to learn how we ran deception ops. Hayes reached into his briefcase and produced a formal offer. Commendation for your grandfather. Full honors at burial. A generous settlement for your family's loss. In exchange, you'll turn over every piece of evidence, agree to the official account, and participate in controlled debriefs to confirm nothing classified has been exposed. David read the page. It was polished, patriotic, and a payoff to end the investigation. And if I refuse? Stone's expression cooled. You've accessed classified material without clearance, conducted unauthorized inquiries into active intelligence matters, and shared details with foreign nationals. That's enough for court-martial. Hayes added, you'd lose your commission. Your family's name would be stained, and your grandfather would be remembered not as a hero, but as the reason his grandson broke the law. Thornton's discomfort was visible, but she didn't dispute the threats. David thought of Frank, old but unbroken, still guarding the truth. Of Bobby's last desperate transmission. Of the men in suits watching him from across the street. Of every shadowy warning that told him someone, somewhere, still feared what he might uncover. I want legal counsel before I commit to anything, David said, his voice clipped but firm. Stone rose smoothly. You have 24 hours to weigh our offer. After that, the terms disappear, and the situation will be handled differently. David narrowed his eyes. Define differently. Hayes's smile was almost pleasant, but his tone carried ice. Let's just say not every inquiry ends with a report. Some end with unfortunate incidents. Your grandfather learned that lesson the hard way. As he stepped out of the embassy, the parallel with Bobby's fate felt impossible to ignore. 60 years earlier, his grandfather had stood at the same fork in the road. Accept the safety of silence or chase the truth into dangerous territory. The difference was, Bobby had understood the stakes from the start. David was only now beginning to feel the trap closing. A nondescript sedan idled at the curb. Inside, Detective Dubois waved him over. Get in, Captain. We need to talk. Henley's got something about Blackbird you have to hear. Sliding into the passenger seat, David knew this was the point of no return. Whatever came next would either put him on the same pedestal as his grandfather, or in the same grave. What did Frank say? Blackbird didn't vanish in 45, Dubois said as the car pulled into traffic. According to Henley, he stayed in Allied intelligence for decades, and 10 years ago, someone started tying up loose ends, eliminating the remaining Stalag 17C survivors. Henley's the last man standing. A cold certainty settled in David's chest. So you think Blackbird's still alive? Alive as of a decade ago, Dubois confirmed. And still dangerous. They drove out of the city to a safe house, an old farmhouse tucked among rolling fields, arranged through Belgian intelligence contacts. Inside, Frank sat at a worn oak table, looking more tired than that morning but with eyes still lit by a hard, enduring fire. "Let me guess," Frank said as David entered. "They fed you the mission story, told you your grandfather died on a classified mission, offered you medals and a neat ending." David said nothing. "I know because I've heard that same pitch for 6 decades. It's what they tell anyone who gets too close. Play along and live in comfort, or keep digging and pay the price." Dubois opened a manila folder, spreading its contents on the table. "Frank's been collecting this for years. Show him." From another folder, Frank drew out yellowed newspaper articles, clipped obituaries, and official-looking accident reports. 7 of us walked out of 17C alive. We kept in touch, shared notes, and tried to connect the dots. Then we started dying, one by one. David leafed through the timeline Frank had handwritten. Hartwell, 53, car wreck in London. Miller took a fall down his own stairs in Paris. Page, 68, heart failure in a doctor's office. Vincent Torres, 84, house leveled by a gas leak in California. Walter Briggs, 7, drowned while fishing alone. Dubois tapped the most recent entry. Ernest Kellerman, 2014, the only survivor besides Frank. Frank's voice dropped. "Ernie called me in 2013. He'd found something in newly declassified files, something that was named Blackbird." "What did he find?" David asked. Frank slid over photocopies of personnel files, blacked out in places, but still revealing enough. Service dates, assignments, and locations. Blackbird wasn't just a code name. It was the working identity of one Allied officer, a man who oversaw joint operations between the U.S., Britain, and the Free French. He had total access, communications codes, extraction plans, agent rosters, mission schedules, and he sold them to the Germans. "Why?" David asked. "Not ideology, money." Ernie traced payments from German intelligence through Swiss banks. And here's the kicker. The payments didn't end in 45. They kept coming through the Cold War. Blackbird was sold to the Soviets too, and sometimes right back to the Americans. He was a broker of secrets, loyal to no one but his own wallet. David stared at him. A triple agent. "The perfect cover," Frank said. "Deep inside the system, trusted by everyone." Finally, Frank pulled a single sheet from the bottom of the stack. "Ernie sent me this 3 days before he died." David read the shaky handwriting aloud. "Found him. Blackbird is Major William Garrett, later Colonel Garrett, Pentagon Intelligence Liaison. Still alive, confirmed active as of 2013. Garrett's been erasing his wartime trail for decades," Frank said flatly. "Every loose end has been tied off, permanently. Your grandfather's death was just one more step to keep him invisible. We're all still on his list. If anything happens to me, what I've gathered is in safety deposit box 347 at the First National Bank of Richmond. The key's hidden in my basement, 3rd row from the floor, east wall behind a loose brick." David's eyes narrowed. "And Kellerman's research? Did you ever find it?" Frank's expression hardened. "I did. After Ernie's funeral, I drove straight to Richmond. The key was right where he said. Inside the box, 60 years of proof linking William Garrett to the codename Blackbird." "What sort of proof?" Frank pushed a new stack of documents across the table, old but meticulously organized. Financial ledgers showing direct transfers from German, Soviet, and other spy agencies. Photocopies of classified Allied briefings Garrett passed to foreign governments. And the most damning, communication intercepts tying him to every leak that sabotaged our missions. David flipped through the records, scanning totals that made his stomach turn. Millions, paid over decades, and all of it pointing back to Garrett. Frank gave a grim nod. As of last year, he's still breathing, 94 years old. Lives in a private care facility in Arlington. He's still got friends in the intelligence world, people who have a stake in keeping his name out of the history books. Dubois scribbled notes. That explains the embassy's stonewalling. If Garrett's alive and still connected, he could pull strings to shut us down. David's phone lit with a message from Colonel Thornton. Your 24 hours are up. Report to the embassy now for your final decision. Frank caught the look on his face. They're not giving you till tomorrow. Once Garrett's aware you've got this, he'll move first. Kellerman was dead within hours of uncovering Garrett's identity. Torres died the day after speaking to a military historian. Your grandfather, he sent proof of Blackbird's treachery and didn't live to see it acted on. David's chest felt heavy. So whatever I choose, they're planning to silence me. Unless you flip the board, Frank said quietly. Bobby died trying to get this into the right hands. You could finish what he began. Dubois leaned in. Belgium can protect you, if you formally request asylum and present evidence of credible threats. David stared at the evidence. 60 years of betrayal, a trail of corpses, and a name that had outlived wars. Frank, what would Bobby have wanted? The old man's eyes softened. He believed some truths were worth dying for, and some were worth living for. The real question is whether you're willing to spend the rest of your life making sure this one survives. The phone rang. Thornton's voice was tight. David, where are you? Stone and Hayes want your answer. One question, Colonel. Do you know who William Garrett is? There was a pause, then a strained whisper. Stop asking questions and come in. Please. The line went dead. David looked at Frank. If I do this, what happens to you? I'm 97, Captain. My clock's been running out for decades. You're the one who could still see justice done and live to defend it. Dubois began gathering the files. We can get this out of U.S. reach. Multiple safe routes. Once you're clear, you hit every major news outlet at once. David exhaled, feeling the decision crystallize. Frank, will you swear to all of this in public? I've been ready for 60 years. David turned to Dubois. Then I'm invoking protective custody under Belgian law. I have evidence of an active criminal conspiracy inside American intelligence and credible threats to my life. Within hours, the Belgian Federal Police's secure communications suite was alive with movement. Through encrypted video links, David and Frank spoke to investigative teams from the Washington Post, the BBC, and Le Monde simultaneously. We'll need independent confirmation before publishing, said Sarah Chen from the Post. These are extraordinary claims against a senior intelligence figure. Despite his age, Frank's voice was steady as he recounted the chain of evidence. Garrett didn't just sell out Allied operations in the war. The records Ernest Kellerman compiled prove he was still cashing in through the Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and even Vietnam. The BBC's James Morrison leaned closer. You're asserting that one man compromised decades of intelligence for personal gain. I'm not asserting, I'm proving, Frank replied, gesturing to the stacks of documents. David angled Garrett's Swiss bank statements into the camera. Over $40 million in today's value. German, Soviet, Chinese. Payments spanning from 43 to 2010, all tied to one man. That was when Dubois re-entered, his face grim. Captain, we've got a serious situation, Dubois said, stepping into the secure room. The U.S. Embassy has filed formal extradition papers through several diplomatic channels. They're accusing you of stealing classified intelligence and labeling you a flight risk. On the split-screen conference call, Dr. Marie Dubois of Le Monde, the French investigative journalist, spoke up. If they're moving this aggressively, it means they see your information as genuinely dangerous. You don't push for extradition at this speed unless you're trying to bury something real. David's encrypted phone buzzed, displaying Colonel Thornton's name. David, listen closely. Her voice was taut. Stone and Hayes are no longer in control of your case. It's been passed to agencies I can't even identify. You're now in the crosshairs of people with bottomless resources and zero oversight. So is this a warning? Or a threat, Colonel? David asked. I'm warning you, she replied after a pause. I've seen the unredacted version of your grandfather's service record, the one that's been locked away above my clearance for 20 years. Bobby wasn't simply chasing Blackbird. He was working alongside a small group of Allied officers who suspected there was a high-level mole inside their own command. And David. Many of those men died under suspicious circumstances, officially listed as combat losses, but the pattern suggests otherwise. Frank leaned toward the speaker. Colonel, how many deaths are we talking about? At least a dozen, between 43 and 45, she said quietly. Every one of them had been asking the wrong questions about compromised operations in their sector. Sarah Chen from the Washington Post cut in from her feed. Colonel, will you state that on the record? I'll confirm this much, Thornton replied. Lieutenant Robert Mitchell's file is under lock and key by agencies that don't want World War II intelligence operations re-examined. That fact alone should tell you how credible Captain Mitchell's findings are. When the line went dead, David sat back, absorbing the implications. Garrett hadn't just been an infiltrator during the war. He'd kept the machinery of secrecy intact for decades, able to bury any evidence or silence any witness. The video conference dragged on for hours as each journalist cross-checked Frank's archive against independent records. By evening, they'd agreed on a coordinated release plan. All major outlets would publish the story simultaneously the next morning, with every supporting document made public to prevent selective redaction or quiet deletion. Once the last feed disconnected, Dubois took a call from Belgian intelligence headquarters. They'll grant you protective custody, but he hesitated. The Americans are escalating. They're invoking NATO agreements and claiming espionage. If they pivot to labeling you a terrorism suspect, our government will be legally obliged to consider handing you over. Before David could answer, his secure phone vibrated with an encrypted text. Location blown. Garrett's network knows exactly where you are. Move now. A friend. Frank read it over his shoulder and stood, his face tight. If Garrett's got contacts inside Belgian law enforcement, we can't stay here another minute. Dubois was already checking his sidearm and radio. I'll set up transport to a new safe house. But understand this, if he can find you here, he can find you anywhere. As they moved toward the door, David's laptop pinged with an incoming video call. The caller ID stopped him cold. William Garrett. Frank's expression turned ashen. Don't answer. I have to, David said, his voice low. We need to hear what he's planning. He clicked accept. The image resolved into an elderly man seated in a lavish apartment, the light-catching eyes that were sharp and calculating despite the decades. Captain Mitchell, Garrett began smoothly, I believe you've acquired property that belongs to me. David didn't flinch. What I have is proof you've been selling out Allied operations for over 60 years. Garrett's smile was faint but mocking. Treason is an antiquated word. I've kept the balance of power stable, ensuring no single nation grows dangerously dominant. Your grandfather couldn't grasp the broader vision. He understood you were getting soldiers killed for personal gain. David shot back. Your grandfather was a well-meaning boy who stumbled into a game he couldn't play. Just like you, Garrett said. Frank stepped into view. Hello, William. I told you 6 decades ago you'd answer for what you did to those men. Garrett's gaze chilled. Henley. Still alive. I had hoped nature would have resolved that problem. Sorry to disappoint, Frank replied. But I've lived long enough to watch you fall. Justice, Garrett said, almost amused, is a fantasy for people who don't understand how the world works. Captain, you have 1 hour to erase every copy of your evidence and report to the American Embassy. Do that, and this ends quietly. And if I don't, then I'll show you why I've outlasted everyone else in this business. You're not dealing with a frail old veteran. You're facing a man who's built networks across governments and agencies. Your grandfather learned the cost of defiance too late. Don't make the same mistake. The connection ended. Frank put a hand on David's shoulder. Now you see exactly who we're up against. Captain, that man's been intimidating and silencing people for 6 decades, Dubois said as he moved briskly through the room, already giving orders to his team. But Garrett's never had to face someone armed with modern global media, encrypted communications, and international law enforcement backing. We're transferring you to a secure site outside Belgian jurisdiction. Once the articles go live tomorrow, his ability to bury this dies with them. David gathered up the evidence packets, glancing at Frank. If we push ahead, Garrett won't just come after me. He'll come for you too. Are you sure you want to see this through? The old man's lips curled into a faint smile. Son, Garrett's been trying to put me in the ground for most of my adult life. At this point, living long enough to watch him fall has become my personal mission. As they stepped out, David understood. With sudden clarity, this was no longer an investigation into a decades-old crash. This was the final stage of a mission his grandfather had begun in 1943. A mission aimed at exposing a traitor who had hidden behind classified files and government shields for 60 years. By tomorrow morning, the name Blackbird and William Garrett's legacy would no longer be hidden. Their destination was an abandoned NATO communications complex near Liège, mothballed since the Cold War but still equipped with underground bunkers, redundant power, and functioning encrypted channels. Dubois had secured the site through trusted contacts in Belgian military intelligence, hoping it would remain invisible to anyone hunting them until the morning deadline. Inside, David began setting up secure video links to the international press network, while Frank methodically arranged 6 decades of evidence into a single, precise timeline. The coordinated publication was locked for 0600 GMT, just under 8 hours away. The Post confirms the Swiss accounts are genuine, David reported. BBC's verified the sequence of the survivor deaths. Le Monde traced Garrett's hand in undermining French resistance operations. Frank paused, frowning. We're still missing one thing. Proof he's not just a relic from history. We need evidence that Garrett is still active, still pulling strings. What makes you so sure? David asked. If he's threatening us today, it means his networks are still alive, Frank replied. Otherwise, he wouldn't have the reach to hit back. Dubois entered with a tight expression. Fresh intelligence. Unusual movements at several American facilities in Europe. Rapid deploy aircraft spinning up. Embassy security being reinforced. Intel personnel recalled from the field. And he hesitated. Our intercepts suggest Garrett's protection web includes European agencies as well. Frank nodded grimly. That tracks. A man who's been selling secrets to every side for 60 years isn't just protected by Washington. London, Paris, Berlin, they'd all have reasons to keep him buried. David's encrypted phone buzzed again. It was Sarah Chen from the Washington Post. Captain Mitchell, we've uncovered something big. Garrett didn't retire in the 80s like the official records claim. Pentagon sources say he worked as a consultant until at least 2015. His specialty? Negotiating intel sharing agreements between NATO members and former Soviet bloc states. Meaning, Frank said, leaning toward the phone, he's had access to current intelligence flows. He's not just hiding old sins, he's managing ongoing ones. Sarah's tone sharpened, and we've linked him to multiple high-profile intelligence disasters in the last 20 years. All compromised operations where he had oversight authority. David felt the realization settle in like ice. So he's not just a figure from the past, he's the common denominator in failures spanning 70 years. When the call ended, David knew the story had outgrown their original scope. They weren't exposing a historical betrayal. They were uncovering an active security threat, one that the world's most powerful intelligence services had chosen to protect. Dubois' radio crackled with another warning. American Special Operations units just deployed across Europe. Official word is counter-terrorism exercises. But the timing is too precise. They're moving to grab you before sunrise. Frank pushed himself upright, leaning on the table for support. They'll hit us before we can publish. David checked the clock. 4 hours until release. Can we hold here? Not if they bring military hardware, Dubois replied. This site won't stay hidden forever. David made the call. We split up. Frank, you take half the archive and go with Dubois. Hide. I'll keep the press connections alive here. That's a death sentence, Captain, Frank said sharply. They'll break you for the rest of the evidence. Which is why you need to disappear, David countered. You're 97. You can hide better than you can run. If they take me, they still won't have enough to kill the story. Frank's grip tightened on David's forearm. Your grandfather failed because he was alone. Don't repeat that. This time we've got journalists, law enforcement, and redundant evidence caches. Even if they shut us down, they can't stop the truth now. Dubois was already monitoring the channels, eyes darting between screens as the threat level rose. Gentlemen, there's no time left to argue, Dubois cut in sharply. American units are already mobilizing toward this sector. We need to move now. Before David could reply, his laptop signaled another incoming encrypted feed. Garrett's name flashed across the screen. Don't, Frank warned. David clicked accept anyway. The image resolved. Garrett, flanked by two younger men in dark suits, no longer in the comfort of his apartment. Captain Mitchell, Garrett began, voice calm but edged with steel. I extended you an opportunity to walk away. You chose to push this further. You gave me a choice between silence and complicity, David shot back. In 3 hours, the world will know what you've been doing for 6 decades. Garrett's smile was thin. Will they? Are you certain your allies in the press are even free to publish? A whisper from one of his aides drew a slow nod from Garrett. Ms. Chen, now in FBI custody, charged with handling classified material. Morrison, being interviewed by MI5 regarding unlawful possession of restricted information. Dr. Marie Dubois, detained in Paris for holding state documents acquired without authorization. Frank's face drained of color. He's gone after the journalists. Not gone. After, Garrett corrected smoothly. They're merely detained. Fascinating how quickly terrorism statutes can be leveraged when someone poses a threat to national security. David's secure handset buzzed. Urgent texts from editors confirming the arrests. You see, Captain, Garrett continued, I've had 6 decades to cultivate relationships with people who understand that some truths are hazardous. Your crusade endangers not just me, but those who have thrived on the intelligence I've provided. Dubois was already on comms with Brussels. Captain, political pressure's mounting. Belgian authorities are being pushed to hand you over to the Americans. NATO allies are filing formal complaints about unsanctioned intelligence operations on their soil. Garrett leaned forward, that knowing smirk returning. The beauty of a career like mine? Eventually, everyone becomes invested in your survival. Every nation that benefited from what I supplied, every agency whose success depended on my work, they all have skin in the game. David's stomach knotted as the scale of Garrett's network hit home. It wasn't just a U.S. cover-up. This was an international pact of mutual protection. But Frank was staring hard at the image on the monitor. William, you slipped. Garrett arched an eyebrow. How so? You're not in your care home. That's a secure government site. Langley, if I'm not mistaken. Which means you're not just shielding old files. You're running live operations. Garrett's expression froze for half a beat. Captain, Frank said urgently, record this. We've got him on video coordinating suppression of evidence and targeting witnesses. That's active obstruction and intimidation. David started the recording, heart pounding. Mr. Garrett, thank you for confirming you're still an active participant in an ongoing conspiracy. That will be very useful in court. For the first time, Garrett's composure cracked. You're out of your depth, Mitchell. You have no idea how high these stakes go. No, David replied, voice steady. I know exactly what's at stake, finishing the mission my grandfather died for. And this time, the evidence isn't disappearing into a classified vault. He cut the call. Dubois was already routing the recording. Sending to trusted outlets in Germany, Italy, and Japan now. But, Captain, if he can orchestrate journalist arrests across NATO, Europe isn't safe for you. Frank snapped his portfolio shut. Then we take this outside NATO's reach. Somewhere, his influence is thinner. David thought fast. I've got contacts in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, strong investigative press, no NATO obligations. Dubois nodded. I can have you on a flight in 6 hours to a country with no extradition agreement. Once you're out of Europe, you're on your own. Frank leaned heavily on his cane, his voice firm. Captain, I've waited 60 years for Garrett to make a mistake. He just did. I'm not stopping now. As they gathered the files, David realized Garrett's aggressive counterattack had backfired. Now they had proof of current crimes, coordinated arrests, intimidation, and ongoing operational control. The case wasn't just historical anymore. The outbound cargo plane lifted from Brussels under the cover of night. 18 hours to Auckland. In the dim cabin, David and Frank worked side by side, cross-verifying archives, setting secure publication triggers. Dubois had smoothed their departure through unofficial channels, but once they cleared European airspace, their safety net would vanish. The Sydney Morning Herald has confirmed receipt of the full dossier, David reported mid-flight. The Auckland Star has authenticated the banking data. The Cape Town Gazette is linking with anti-corruption networks across Africa. Frank, pale but determined, kept arranging evidence packets. Every outlet goes live at the same moment. If he gets early wind, he'll start poisoning the well before the truth lands. David's sat phone rang. Encrypted. Colonel Thornton's voice came through tense and low. David, tell me you're somewhere they can't reach. Janet. David asked the moment he answered. What's your status? Are they holding you too? Not yet, Thornton replied, her tone clipped. But I'm already under investigation for leaking classified information. David, you need to understand. This has escalated into something I haven't seen in over 2 decades of intelligence work. He gripped the phone tighter. Meaning what? Meaning Garrett isn't just an old spook clinging to wartime secrets. Sources I can't name tell me he's been running an entire shadow network. A parallel intelligence operation that spans multiple agencies, multiple nations. Your digging has rattled a structure that reaches the very top of NATO governments. Frank leaned close so his voice carried over the line. Colonel, how far up does this go? Far enough, she said after a pause, that 3 current intelligence chiefs resigned in the last 24 hours without explanation. Far enough that the CIA director is pretending he knew nothing about Garrett's activities after retirement. Far enough that the president's being briefed every hour on damage control. David felt the rush of grim satisfaction, mixed with the cold edge of fear. They're scared because they know we can prove it. They're scrambling, she corrected, because Garrett's dealings have jeopardized national security for decades, and anyone who knew, even tangentially, is now staring down the barrel of criminal charges and an international scandal. By the time their plane touched down in Auckland at 4 a.m. local time, arrangements had been made. Instead of arresting them, officers from New Zealand, Security Intelligence Service, met them on the tarmac. You'll have protective custody while we coordinate with your media contacts, said Inspector Sarah Williams, leading them away from the private terminal. New Zealand law doesn't allow extradition for whistleblowing of this nature. Here, you're safe, at least until the story hits. They were driven to a discreet government complex with sweeping views over Auckland Harbour. From there, secure links were established to newsrooms in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The time zones worked to their advantage. While much of Europe and North America slept, their southern hemisphere contacts were in the middle of their working day. David spent hours on encrypted calls. The Melbourne Age has tied Garrett's hand to the East Timor intelligence blunder, he reported to Frank. The Wellington Post traced him directly to the flawed Iraq WMD assessments. Frank, surrounded by decades of meticulously organized documents, suddenly tapped the table. Look at this timeline, Captain. Every major intelligence failure in the past 20 years lines up with operations requiring multinational cooperation. The same kind Garrett facilitated as a consultant. David scanned the list. September 11th. Iraq's missing weapons. Russian election interference. Either he's the most incompetent officer in history, David muttered, or he's been deliberately sabotaging missions to serve someone else's agenda. Inspector Williams stepped in from an adjoining office, holding a fresh intelligence brief. You should know, several European agencies are now insisting Garrett's actions were sanctioned under classified international accords, agreements that don't officially exist, but would conveniently explain everything as authorized intelligence sharing for global stability. Frank snorted. 60 years later, and they're still spinning the same story. Garrett didn't keep the peace. He profited from making sure no side ever gained the upper hand. The sat phone rang again, displaying an unfamiliar international code. This is Captain Mitchell. Captain, said a calm voice. This is Ambassador Chen Wei, Ministry of State Security, People's Republic of China. We understand you possess evidence concerning an American intelligence officer. We have reason to believe this individual sold Chinese intelligence to multiple Western services over several decades. We propose a meeting to discuss mutual cooperation. When the line went dead, David looked between Frank and Williams. Frank's jaw tightened. If Garrett was selling to Beijing too, then this isn't just NATO's dirty laundry. He's been playing everyone, East and West, for 60 years. Williams' phone buzzed with another incoming update. Gentlemen, brace yourselves. We now have requests for information from over 20 countries. Garrett's fingerprints are on. Operations spanning the globe. David finalized the release plan with his media partners. 6 hours from now, everything drops at once. Multiple servers, mirrored worldwide. No chance of suppression. Frank eased himself up from his chair and stepped to the window. The dawn light reflected off the harbor. Your grandfather would be proud, Captain. After 6 decades, Garrett's going to answer for what he's done. You holding up all right? David asked quietly. The old man's smile was weary but resolute. I'm 97 years old, son. I've carried this fight for most of my life. I'll rest after I see his face on the front page. David's phone chimed, a final message from Garrett himself. Enjoy your victory, Captain. But remember, some truths carry consequences far beyond the lives of those who reveal them. 6 hours later, the first wave of headlines swept across 3 continents. American spy sold secrets for 6 decades. From Sydney to Cape Town, the story dominated every front page. The files were exhaustive: bank trails, declassified memos, intercepted transmissions, too comprehensive to be dismissed as rumor. By midday, the fallout was already seismic. Arrest warrants were issued, governments called emergency sessions, and in Langley, Virginia, William Garrett was taken into custody inside CIA headquarters, formally charged with treason, espionage, and a criminal conspiracy that had spanned nearly 70 years. The shock waves from Garrett's arrest didn't stop at Langley. Within days, high-ranking intelligence officers in a dozen nations were also taken into custody. Men and women who had knowingly shielded his activities for decades. Newspapers around the globe splashed the same headline: the longest-running espionage case in modern history. At the center of it all stood a frail but unshakable Frank Henley. At 97, he had become the chief witness whose testimony cracked open a conspiracy that had survived 3 generations. And finally, after 80 years in the shadows, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Mitchell, missing since 1943, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The recognition was for his doomed attempt to expose the betrayal that had cost countless Allied lives, and for a mission that had taken more than half a century to finish. From a quiet room in Auckland, David Mitchell watched the news coverage. The accolades, the ceremonial speeches, the photographs of his grandfather's younger face projected on giant screens. It all felt surreal. But deep down, he understood that the real victory wasn't the medal, or even the arrests. The real triumph was that truth had finally broken through 60 years of lies. Bobby's mission was done. 6 months later, under a soft spring sky in Arlington National Cemetery, Bobby Mitchell was laid to rest at last. His remains had been repatriated from Belgium after investigators confirmed the crash site. The casket, draped in the American flag, was lowered with full military honors, the ceremony delayed by 6 decades of secrecy. Frank, now 98, sat in the front row, leaning on his cane. His sworn testimony had been instrumental in convicting William Garrett on charges of treason, espionage, and conspiracy spanning 7 decades. The trial had lasted 4 months, peeling back the layers of betrayal that had shaped international events since World War II. The honor guard stood rigid, rifles snapping into position at the order of "present arms." As the casket descended into the earth, David accepted the folded flag from the commander, his thoughts drifting through the long chain of events, from a 1943 drainage tunnel to a guarded facility in New Zealand in 2024, that had finally completed his grandfather's mission. When the crowd dispersed, David and Frank walked slowly between the white marble headstones toward the tomb of the unknown soldier. "What do you think Bobby would say about all this?" David asked. Frank stopped, considering. "I think he'd be proud that the truth came out, but prouder still that it came out the right way, through evidence, cooperation, and the law, not through vengeance." David nodded. In the wake of Garrett's conviction, the International Tribunal had set historic legal precedents for prosecuting intelligence crimes that spanned multiple decades and crossed national borders. 12 nations had already revised their intelligence oversight systems. NATO had implemented safeguards to prevent rogue parallel operations like Garrett's from forming again. "Have you heard his sentence?" David asked. Frank's mouth curved into a grim smile. "Life in a federal cell, no parole. At 94, Garrett will die behind bars. Justice was late, but it wasn't denied." They found a bench overlooking the ceremonial grounds. Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a faded black and white photograph, the same one David had once recovered from the wreck of Bobby's plane. "I've been thinking about this picture," Frank said, running his thumb along the creased edges. "Your grandfather, I, and the other men who knew the truth about Blackbird. Back then, we thought the war would end with a clear victory. Instead, you learned, as I did, that some wars don't have neat endings." He looked at David. "But you also learned that some fights are worth waging for generations. Bobby began something in 43. We brought it home in 2024. That's not failure. That's endurance." David's phone buzzed. It was Inspector Williams from New Zealand Intelligence. "Captain Mitchell, the tribunal has just declassified the full record of Garrett's operations," she said. "It's worse than anyone imagined. Activity in 47 countries over 6 decades. More than $200 million in covert payments. His betrayals shaped the outcome of 3 major wars, a dozen global crises, and untold smaller missions." Frank leaned close to the speaker. "And the families. The men who died because of him. They'll be compensated from a special victims fund," Williams replied. "And an international database is being set up to detect long-term intelligence corruption before it can take root again." When the call ended, they sat in silence among the graves. "Frank," David said quietly, "do you ever think about what might have happened if Bobby had succeeded back in 43? "Every day," Frank answered. "Thousands more would have lived. Dozens of missions might have worked. The Cold War itself could have unfolded differently. But," he met David's gaze, "he died believing that some truths are worth any cost, and I've spent 60 years proving him right." David thought of the path that had carried him from a routine crash site review to dismantling an international conspiracy. His military career had ended the day he'd sought asylum in Belgium. But now the Department of Defense wanted him to lead investigations for a newly formed International Intelligence Oversight Commission, digging into other historical betrayals buried under decades of classification. "I think Bobby would want me to take it," David said at last, "because there are probably other secrets like this, other crimes that have been protected by the same mix of bureaucracy and fear." Frank's eyes softened. "He'd be proud. But promise me something, Captain." "What's that?" "Promise you'll remember the difference between secrets that shield a nation and secrets that shield criminals." Bobby understood that difference. That's why he died. David clasped Frank's hand, a firm handshake between two men who both knew it might be their last. At 98, Frank Henley had finally completed the mission he'd carried since he was a young soldier in a German prison camp. And David Mitchell, standing over his grandfather's grave, understood that the fight for truth wasn't over. It never really would be. William Garrett was behind bars. His influence, once untouchable, had been dismantled piece by piece in a courtroom for the world to see. The conspiracy that had survived for 6 decades was no longer whispered in shadows. It was written in headlines, printed in tribunal records, and carved into the annals of intelligence history. And at long last, Lieutenant Robert Bobby Mitchell's name was cleared. No longer a ghost of an abandoned mission, he was officially recognized as the hero he had been all along. As David left Arlington Cemetery, the sound of the honor guard's rifles still echoing in his ears, he thought about the mission that had shaped his grandfather's final moments in 1943. On paper, it had been straightforward. Primary objective: extract high-value Allied intelligence assets from a German POW facility. Secondary objective: destroy the site to prevent reprisals. Bobby had failed the first part. Capturing prisoners had been impossible once the mission was compromised. But the second, unspoken objective, the real objective, had been completed. He had discovered the traitor leaking Allied secrets. He had uncovered William Garrett. It had taken 60 years, the cooperation of multiple nations, and the perseverance of men like Frank Henley, but that mission was finally over. David's phone buzzed. A secure message from the newly formed International Intelligence Oversight Commission. Captain Mitchell, your first case involves missing OSS operatives in the Pacific Theater, 1944 to 1945. Files suggest possible betrayal similar to the Garrett case. Report for briefing on Monday. David allowed himself a quiet smile. In Bobby's final transmission from that drainage tunnel in 1943, his grandfather had written, "If I don't survive, investigate all missions authorized through Blackbird Channel." The work wasn't finished. Somewhere, other families were still waiting for answers. Other names lost to history were waiting to be cleared. And now, it was his turn to carry the torch. He drove away from Arlington under a sky streaked with autumn gold, the setting sun casting long shadows over the rows of white marble headstones. Every grave marked a life given in service, a promise made that their sacrifice would mean something. Bobby Mitchell was finally home. His mission, at last, was complete. But Captain David Mitchell's mission had only begun. Some operations take months, others years. The most important ones can take a lifetime, or more than one. And when they finally reach their end, they are always worth finishing.